So Frank Warren has once again called for Anthony Joshua to fight his man, Daniel Dubois. Now, he's actually been calling for this fight for, I want to say, at least 2 years. But in this instance, it's in the wake of AJ having a good victory over Otto Wallin and Daniel Dubois having what some would describe as a career best performance against Jarrell Miller. So it's a good fight as far as I'm concerned. However, I don't think it's particularly likely at this stage. And that comes down to the position that AJ and Daniel Dubois are in their respective careers. So, for example, if we have a look at the heavyweight rankings here, and they haven't yet been updated, so in the wake of their recent victories, they're both going to move up, you would assume anyway. So AJ is number 2 with the WBC, number 3 with the WBA and IBF, and number 1 with the WBO. By contrast, Daniel Dubois is number 14 with the WBC, number 7 with the WBA, number 8 with the IBF and WBO. So he's much lower in the rankings than Anthony Joshua is. AJ presumably is going to move up to number 1 because Wilder obviously lost to Joseph Parker in the WBC rankings. In the WBA rankings, he may move up to number 2 and Martin Bakole will move up to number 1. In the IBF, he's surely going to take Otto Wallin's spot at number 2. And he's already number 1 in the WBO anyway. So what does Anthony Joshua gain at this stage from fighting a guy who's so much lower than him in the rankings? He would gain something by fighting a Filip Hrgović, by fighting maybe even a Zhilei Zhang, who is WBO interim champion. I say Hrgović because we're assuming the IBF belt will become vacant after the first Usyk-Fury fight if they decide to have an immediate rematch, in which case AJ could fight Hrgović for the vacant title. Even if AJ was to fight a number 1 contender in, let's say, the WBC or the WBA in a final eliminator, that might make more sense to him than fighting a Daniel Dubois. Unless, of course, they elevate Dubois up to the number 2 or number 1 position right next to AJ in one of these rankings, then it might become more of a viable fight. But at this stage, again, AJ's just beaten the number 2 in the IBF and Otto Wallin. Why would he fight someone so much lower than him in the rankings if his goal is to get a title shot sooner rather than later? You see, contenders do not have the privileges that champions have. They're trying to fight for their position. They're trying to better their lot all the time. Now, obviously, if you end up in a stagnant position where you can't seem to get a final eliminator, then in that situation, yeah, you're going to have to gamble, fight somebody lower down the ranks, etc., etc. But in most cases, when you're a contender, you want to get something out of taking a risk. So if you're going to fight one of the other contenders, you want it to be some type of eliminator, some type of ranking match, some type of match that moves your career forward for taking that risk, rather than just having these random fights that are not really going to get you anywhere in terms of ranking or title shot. In some instances, of course, you will have fights that are big money makers. When Otto Wallin fought Anthony Joshua, that's a guy below him. I don't think that was any kind of eliminator, but for Otto Wallin, that made loads of sense because the opportunity to beat somebody as high profile as AJ and the money that he was getting off the Saudis made it worth it. For Anthony Joshua, similar thing. How much money would he really make off a Daniel Dubois fight? Would it be significantly more than he would make fighting Zhilei Zhang or Filip Hrgović or anybody else that is highly ranked, let's say in the top 3 of any of the sanctioning bodies? You guys let me know what you think in the comment section below. Now, having said all that, I'll reiterate what I said a few moments ago. I would like to see Anthony Joshua versus Daniel Dubois. I think Daniel Dubois went a long way to redeeming himself with that Jarrell Miller performance. So if the fight got made, I certainly wouldn't be grumbling, but I couldn't really begrudge Anthony Joshua for fighting somebody like, let's say, a Filip Hrgović or a Zhilei Zhang instead. It's not like either of those guys are rubbish. They're both dangerous fighters. Filip Hrgović is still officially unbeaten. Zhilei Zhang has got 1 loss, which was to Filip Hrgović. So if AJ took any of them fights instead of fighting Daniel Dubois, no problem at all. The issue that I have, particularly with champions in boxing, is when they take a lesser opponent instead of fighting a better opponent. It's one thing to turn down a fight only to fight somebody better, but it's another thing to turn down a fight and fight somebody worse. That's the issue I have particularly with champions. Why it's not so much of an issue with contenders is because they are usually punished if they do not continue to fight better and better competition. That's how they climb up the ranks, or if not better competition, more highly ranked competition. That's how they do it. I mean, you look at Agit Kabayel, he had a great win last weekend over Arslanbek Makhmudov. If you told me that Agit Kabayel would outpoint Makhmudov over the course of whatever it was, 10 or 12 rounds, I'd say, okay, that's feasible. That's plausible, should I say. But if you told me he was going to blast Makhmudov out in 4 rounds, I'd say, no way. But this is heavyweight boxing, folks. Bizarre stuff happens. And that was another example of it. I actually picked Makhmudov to win the fight on points. I thought it would be a cat and mouse type affair with Agit Kabayel being very negative, boxing in a similar way to how he did against Derek Chisora, just trying to play it safe and not get himself in any trouble. I didn't think that would be enough to get the win over Makhmudov. But anyway, I did a full post-fight review on my Patreon page. I won't get into that fight too much. But Agit Kabayel has been, I want to say, in the lower echelons of the top 15 for the past 5-6 years, ever since that Chisora fight, really. He's held the EBU belt, and having the EBU belt gives you, I believe, a top 15 ranking automatically with certain sanctioning bodies. So he's been fighting terrible opposition over the past 5 years or so, Agit Kabayel, but because he's got that EBU belt, he's been able to retain the ranking. But now he's decided to take this risk in fighting Arslanbek Makhmudov, a guy who is much more highly ranked than him. Now he gets the reward that comes with that, which will be a much higher ranking once these rankings are updated by the various sanctioning bodies. You see, that's how it works when you're a contender. If you don't want to take a risk, then you're going to either drop out of the top 15, or if you've got an EBU belt, maybe they'll keep you around number 14 or 13 for years. If you want to get closer to a title shot, you're going to have to take a risk. This is what's different in terms of a contender to a champion. If you're a good contender, that is. If you're a contender that's not particularly dangerous, then yeah, you might get picked as a voluntary. And when I say not particularly dangerous, I'm talking about from the perspective of the champion. If he sees you as an easy mark, then yeah, he might pick you for a voluntary defense. But if you're a dangerous fighter, if you're somebody who the champions see as being very talented and their promoters see you that way, unless you're a cash cow, nobody's going to fight you voluntarily. You're going to have to maneuver yourself into a mandatory position. This is why the life of a contender is usually more difficult than the life of a champion. You have to fight your way into a championship position if you've got any ability. Becoming mandatory and fighting eliminators to get into that spot, so on and so forth. Anyway, don't want to draw this out too much. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about the possibility of Anthony Joshua fighting Daniel Dubois. Do you think now's the time to do the fight? Do you think it would do big numbers? Do you think Daniel Dubois could beat Anthony Joshua? We know we've heard from Frank Warren in the past claiming that Daniel Dubois knocked AJ out in sparring. I think it's very possible. But at the same time, maybe Daniel Dubois got rocked in sparring, dropped in sparring by various fighters as well. I mean, Martin Bakole claims to have dealt with Daniel Dubois in sparring. Filip Hrgović, I believe, is rumored to have dealt with Daniel Dubois in sparring. I mean, people are saying they stopped him or beat him up, etc., etc. A lot of stuff happens in sparring, okay? So it's perfectly plausible to me that Anthony Joshua maybe got dropped by Daniel Dubois somewhere back in the days. But it is what it is. In a professional fight, would it go the same or would it be very different? Would Anthony Joshua be too much for young Daniel Dubois, or would Dubois come out on top? One thing I will say is AJ, I would say, is more talented all round than Dubois, but I think Dubois got the better stamina of the two. He's also got a very good jab. I'm not sure who has the better jab. I might slightly lean towards Dubois' jab. When I say better jab, I'd say AJ's jab is a bit faster, but Dubois' jab to me looks a bit more solid and he's more consistent with his jab. Sometimes AJ can forget about his jab in fights and he neglects it and doesn't use it enough. But yeah, I'd say AJ's jab is a bit more mobile, it's a bit faster, but Dubois' jab is more solid. So it'll be an interesting battle of the jabs in that fight. AJ, I would say, is faster all round, a bit more explosive than Dubois. Dubois' got good feet though. He might have slightly quicker feet than Anthony Joshua. Anthony Joshua can move when he wants to. We saw that in the Andy Ruiz rematch, although he was much lighter in that Ruiz rematch than he is now. So it remains to be seen whether he could move like that at 250 plus pounds. Daniel Dubois is a much lighter fighter. I think he was in the 230s against Jarrell Miller. So maybe Dubois would be slightly more mobile than AJ, but of course he's not quite as tall. His reach isn't quite as long. He's not as heavy. It's an interesting one. It really is. Let me know what you guys think about it in the comments. Are you sick and tired of the mainstream mindset? Does the dogmatic conformity and pathological ignorance have you tearing your hair out in frustration? Then don't be alone. Come and join our brotherhood on Patreon. We stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. You'll gain access to my weekly topical podcast where we take more deep dives than Jacques Cousteau on an endless variety of subjects. There's also videos, interviews, live Q&As, as well as a vast back catalogue of previous episodes, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen via the Patreon app or download in high-quality MP3. Connect with myself and hundreds of other members in our Element chat group. There's no contract, no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a Mickey D's McMuffin. Just head to my Patreon page via the link below this video and select the tier called the Brotherhood of Reason. I'll see you over there.